Hi, I'm Jamie Poisson. The art of espionage. It has been a key part of war in the modern era. And most countries around the world have made deep investments in their spying operations. You probably saw earlier this month that the Russian government got a number of their own spies back in the largest prisoner swap between Russia and the West since the Cold War. The children of a Russian spy couple found out that they were Russian on the flight home. It really was something right out of the TV show The Americans.
Speak Russian.
Мы тебя очень любим, солнышко.
She said we love you very much.
Today, Zach Dorfman is on the show. Zach has been covering national security issues for years, and he has this fantastic, comprehensive piece in Rolling Stone magazine right now. He did extensive interviews with more than 24 former CIA officials for it, talking to them about the secretive program the CIA unrolled after 9/11, where they put spies in really deep cover situations. It centers on this young guy from the Midwest and his journey embedding himself with Islamic radicals in the Middle East. And it really grapples with the dubious ethical lines that define much of the secretive work done by intelligence organizations like the CIA and others. All right, let's get to it. Hi, Zach. Thanks so much for coming into Front Burner.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's begin with the man at the center of this story, someone we know only by pseudonym. He goes by Anthony Lagunas. He's described in your story as a young white man from the American Midwest. And what can you tell me about him? What else can you tell me about him?
Well, he remains a bit of a mystery, right? Anthony Lagunas isn't really his name. It's his pseudonym. And this was the name he went by within the CIA, because most people within the CIA didn't even know his real name. But as you mentioned, he was a white American guy from the Midwest. According to my reporting, he was in his mid to late 20s when he joined the agency. And he loved to surf. Apparently, he had a scar down one of his arms from a barracuda bite. So he had this kind of distinctive needled scar. And he was, he liked to party. This was a picture of somebody who was, a little bit of a wild child. And at the same time was a recruited intelligence officer who went into the CIA just before 9/11.
Right. And as your story goes, he's recruited into this secretive, deep cover CIA program, and he spends more than half a decade undercover. He's believed to have infiltrated groups like Al-Qaeda, really at the height of the group's power. And tell me more about this program and just what exactly Anthony Lagunas was expected to do as part of it.
So within CIA, broadly speaking, there's two kinds of operations officers. There's folks who are under official cover and non-official cover. And official cover is what most spies abroad are under. And that tends to be in the U.S. State Department cover, Foreign Service cover, right? You pose as a diplomat, but in reality, you're a spy. What that means, in effect, is that it's not your connection to the U.S. government that's hidden. It's the fact that you're actually a intelligence officer or a spy undercover, right? There's a much, much smaller group of folks who are under what's known as non-official cover. And that's the kind of cover Lagunas was under. A non-official cover are deep cover spies. Those are the folks who pose as traditionally business people. And those folks have no connection to the US government, right? So it's not only that they're a spy, but it's that they truly are posing as somebody that they're not. And in fact, many of them pose as nationalities other than American, right? So they'll pose as a businessman from, I don't know, a European country. And they'll actually be an American citizen, and they'll actually be working for the CIA. So Lagunas was a non-official cover officer, but what he did was even rare, because instead of being a business person, he went undercover as an Islamist radical.
Tell me more about that. Tell me more about what you know about what he actually did.
Well, in the very, very early months after 9/11, the CIA realized that if it was going to get close to people who had information about Al-Qaeda, right? This was the height of, this is the absolute early days and height of the war on terror. So the CIA realized we need to penetrate these foreign terrorist groups. And how to do that? Well, a business person working for a major tech company wasn't going to do it. You need to actually
Hmm.
have people who could pose as Islamist radicals themselves. And so the idea behind Lagunas was, okay, we got this white guy, and we're gonna, Lagunas had a little bit of knowledge of Arabic, and there was this idea that, you know what, we're gonna have him pretend to convert to Islam and radicalize and go abroad and try to get as close as possible to Al Qaeda or other affiliated terrorist groups. And he went abroad. He spent significant amounts of time in Egypt, I was told, and other places. And he lived and worked at a madrasa. He slept on the floor there. He studied, Arabic and the Quran. And he did this for years. For time, he began to get close to extremist circles.
And what do we know about how close he got and how successful he ultimately was?
Well, there's significant controversy to this day within CIA about the fruits of his operation. And that's actually one of the things that was so striking. I spoke to former CIA officials who said, in my entire agency career, we never had a case like this where there was such polarization around, how effective this operation was. So to some folks within the agency, Lagunas was heroic. He got into Al Qaeda. He produced incredibly valuable intelligence that was routinely passed upward to the CIA director and, then President George W. Bush. And he was the best shining example of this, bravery and savoir-faire of the CIA's non-official cover war in the post 9/11 era, right? So that's one side, right?
Mhm.
This guy is, he's basically a superhero, right?
And at one point, he actually briefs the president, right? Which I understand is quite rare.
It's extraordinarily rare for a rank and file CIA officer to meet the president. The president of the United States meets with the CIA director, and there are dedicated high level intelligence briefers who will routinely meet with the president. But that is an extremely small number of folks. Lagunas was on a rare trip back to the United States from his deep cover assignment abroad. He was snuck into the White House to meet George W. Bush, right? There was a high level effort to get this person in front of the president. And why is a bit controversial. One account is the one that I previously mentioned, which was that he had
Right.
produced so much extraordinary intelligence that he kind of earned it. The other interpretation or the other sense within the agency was that it was more aesthetic. It was that he looked really, really good. Like he actually played the part so well. He had this big, long beard and he convincingly played the part of this convert jihadist, right? But that he actually hadn't produced the kind of intelligence that would lead to deserving a one-on-one audience with the president of the United States, right? So it was really, the CIA trying to impress the president, right? Whether or not the person they were putting in front of him had, done the amazing things that the president might have believed he had done. So it's, whether he, was heroic or whether he was kind of a PR opportunity for the CIA is still kind of a controversial point within CIA circles to this day.
Fair for me to say that the people who would be proponents of the PR opportunity camp, one of the arguments might be that they needed some PR after 9/11. Like, it was seen as a catastrophic failure for the CIA,
And that's
right?
precisely right. I mean, the CIA missed 9/11. I mean, it was I don't mean to make light of it, but it was a deeply traumatic event for Langley, for CIA itself.
Warning is not good enough without the structure to put it into action. We all understood bin Laden's attempt to strike the homeland, but we never translated this knowledge into an effective defense of the country.
We inside the CIA felt that it was our fault. We should have been able to find these guys overseas. We should have been able to disrupt the attack. At the very least, we should have worked with the FBI, which we famously didn't. So there was this feeling of collective guilt.
How palpable is that?
And so once President Bush flipped around and the CIA transformed post 9/11, and there was, this extraordinary refocusing away from, the CIA's bread and butter, right, during the Cold War, which was the Soviet Union, Russia, nation state threats, China, Iran, North Korea, and toward counterterrorism, toward what became the primary foreign policy of the George W. Bush administration, which was the war on terror.
It's a battle, and it's a war of a series of battles that sometimes we'll see the fruits of our labors, and sometimes we won't. It's a war that's going to require cooperation with our friends. It is a war that requires the best of intelligence. You see, the enemy is sometimes hard to find. They like to hide. They think they can hide, but we know better.
I mean,
Mhm.
for the CIA, it needed to show wins to the president fast, right? And it needed to prove not only that, this failure on 9/11 was a one-off, but it also needed to prove that it could provide the kind of intelligence and support that Bush needed to prosecute this global war on terror, right? That had the CIA um, transform into much more of a paramilitary organization than it had been pre 9/11.
We have with us Mr. George Tenet, Director of Central Intelligence.
The war on terrorism, Mr. Chairman, has dealt severe blows to Al-Qaeda and its leadership. Drawing on both our own assets and increased cooperation from allies around the world, we are uncovering terrorist plans and breaking up their cells. These efforts have yielded the arrest of nearly 1,000 Al-Qaeda operatives in over 60 countries and have disrupted terrorist operations and potential terrorist attacks. Most of these countries...
In the interpretation of some of the folks I spoke with, this was part of the broader kind of PR campaign that the CIA was trying to kind of work over President Bush on.
And I just wonder if you could elaborate for me on why these folks exactly don't think that this guy necessarily produced intelligence that, was worthy of the hyper end.
Well, I think there's a couple things there. And one, you hit the nail on the head on one of those, which was that in a program such as Laguna says, there's something within CIA called compartmentation, where there are multiple levels of secrecy within the building. So some of the folks that spoke with said,
Mhm.
look, the people who say that he didn't provide this intelligence, they just didn't have the full knowledge of this program, right? And that's a reasonable argument. Part of the problem, though, is of course that can be used as a shield, right? Where somebody says, well, they just didn't know the full story. Well, maybe they did, maybe they didn't, right? I mean, this is the game of shadows, right? This is the wilderness of mirrors that you get when you report on an organization like the CIA. It's a secret intelligence agency, right? But there's also there's another important dimension to the controversy over Laguna's story, and that has to do with kind of fundamental questions about the nature and role of intelligence in the 21st century, particularly in the war on terror. As I mentioned before, the CIA spent the Cold War with one overwhelming focus, the Soviet Union and its allies, right? It was nation state. It was this is a secret intelligence agency that is focused on recruiting sources and stealing secrets, right? Against another government. And after 9/11, the shift went toward non-state groups, went toward terror groups, and went to paramilitary activities that more often than not dealt with things like targeted assassination. And so within the CIA, there was a sense within the CIA's counterterrorist center, which ran the war on terror essentially, that the only important intelligence was intelligence that led the CIA to be able to kill suspected terrorists. And so for those folks, there was this idea that, like, look, okay, so there's this guy living in a madrasa, and maybe he's making buddy with some folks who may have extremist ties, but if he's not providing us intelligence that says this Taliban leader is going to be in this place at this time to facilitate a drone attack, well, that's like not really very valuable. And so, in a way, he became like a Rorschach test about the first principles of intelligence work in the war on terror.
Were there ever any questions around whether or not it was appropriate to have the CIA like materially support someone undercover like this, essentially offering material support to a terror group? I guess you could make that argument. Like, how do they navigate those questions, those ethical dilemmas?
That's a great question. And I spoke to folks who dealt with this because that's a question that, after reporting this story out for some time, I began to wonder the same thing. Like, what are the trade-offs involved when you send somebody into a terrorist organization? If you're going to do that, they have to act like terrorists, right? And that means you might be supporting logistical operations, but in theory, that could be actually, assisting in providing financing for, or even theoretically carrying out terrorist acts yourself, right? And there's fundamental questions of morality there. So my understanding is that there was a interagency, legal review essentially that was set up to deal with folks like Lagunas and the program of which he was a part. And there were some like fairly strict limits and ideas that you could not yourself participate in terrorist acts. But they got something called material support waivers, right? Which was this idea that they were joining and participating in and assisting terrorist organizations. So they had these legal waivers that governed their behavior. But when I spoke to some folks who, had some real direct understanding of the legal system around this, they said to me, we put them in an impossible position and we recognize that, right? We said to them, look, don't get yourself in a position where you're going to be shooting at U.S. troops in Afghanistan. But if you are in that position, I don't know, shoot over their heads. Like that was literally the guidance they got, right? And I spoke to somebody who recalled a conversation with Lagunas where he expressed, frustrations precisely with this, which was like, they're putting me in an impossible position, right? Because they want me, if I'm going to convincingly infiltrate terrorist organizations, there's only so many times I can beg off on certain activities before they're going to start suspecting me. So there's a moment where, their lives as undercover officers, deep cover officers, are on the line.
The stress of operating in a situation like that, I feel like there are just so few parallels, right? I know much of your piece deals with how that work came at great personal cost for Anthony Lagunas. And what did that cost look like?
So when I spoke to folks that knew him and also were familiar with the kind of broader program that he was a part of, they said to me, look, people like Lagunas are screened for this, right? We need people with really unusual psychological profiles and who can live under extreme stress for long periods of time while kind of like cleaving themselves from themselves. According to the reporting that I did, Lagunas was fine for a while doing this, right? He was okay spending years as somebody else, and pretending to be a convert to Islam and pretending to be essentially, a radical. I mean, to be a violent extremist. But over time, what seems to have happened was it became harder and harder for him to kind of come back. When he would visit CIA for debriefings, very, very occasionally, when he was able to, there was this understanding, this sense that something wasn't quite right with this guy, right? Like that he had maybe been pushed too far over the edge. And so by about 2010, when he was pulled out from this undercover assignment abroad and was still undercover, but no longer as an Islamist extremist, there was a sense among people that knew him that he was a different person and that something was, kind of broken inside of him. I mean, just to put it bluntly. And I just think it's an example of, look, even folks that have that extraordinary ability that he had can only be pushed so far. And it seems like he was pushed over the edge.
And then what happened to him when he eventually comes home?
So he was reassigned to a CIA base in Los Angeles. CIA mostly operates abroad, but it does have domestic bases. There's something called the National Resources Division. And he was, according to my reporting, he's still deep undercover, but he was working in some Hollywood-connected CIA front. But he comes back. He's not the same. Eventually, he ends up in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and he's still with the CIA at this point. And it's there in the fall of 2016 that he dies very, very suddenly. And accounts differ about precisely what the cause of death is. Some folks, point to alcohol or drug use. Some folks say, it was more just, bluntly, it was a suicide. But what everybody says is that, this was the result of these very long, very hard years that he spent so deep undercover. So, he's a casualty of the war on terror that way, right? Like somebody who did the impossible, and emerged a changed person and perhaps did not receive the care that he needed for somebody who had done something so immensely stressful. And so, when he died in 2016, he became known as kind of a cautionary tale within CIA about the difficulty of the kind of work that he did, that others did, and also maybe the lack of available healthcare and mental health care for folks within the agency.
Zach, do you have a sense of how comprehensive these deep cover spy networks are today, whether we're talking about the US or foreign operations in places like Russia, China, Iran, Israel even? How much has changed from, the regime that existed during the war on terror?
Do you have another few hours?
I mean, I do. I could listen to this all day.
The short answer is intelligence services all over the world still use deep cover spying. It will never go away. Some countries have a longer track record of this sort of thing. The US certainly still has deep cover spies. The program has shrunk from its post 9/11 high water mark when there was a vast expansion of the program. It's contracted since then, but it still exists. The Russians are probably the greatest practitioner of these deep cover spies. Throughout the Cold War, and even to today, they have these networks of folks that go undercover for years, decades. In the latest major spy trade that brought Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich back to the U.S., who did the Russians want? They wanted deep cover spies
Yeah.
who had been arrested in Europe, including folks whose, they're posing as, I believe, Argentinian artists in Slovenia, and the two deep cover spies had two children who did not know they were Russian.
I know, this is
No.
craid, and they learned about it
They
on the
learned about it
plane.
on the plane. Like,
yeah.
they think their first language is Spanish and their second language is probably Slovenian. That is
They have no idea they're Russian anyways.
that is the
crazy.
stuff out of spy novels,
Yeah.
right? Where
Yeah.
and the Israelis also have, as you mentioned, a track record of deep cover spies as well, going back many, many, many decades, including at least one very famous case of a Mossad officer who spent years undercover in Syria before the government executed. So yes, countries still do it. It's very dangerous work because, again, if you're not posing as a foreign service officer, you don't have diplomatic immunity, and so you are, instead of being kicked out of the country, you can be imprisoned, you can be tortured, you can be killed, and that was certainly a real live worry for Lagunas and folks doing the kind of work that he did.
Okay. Zach, thank you so much for coming by and sharing all of your reporting with us and your expertise. It was super interesting.
Yeah, I'd be happy to come back anytime.
All right, that's all for today. I'm Jamie Poisson. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you tomorrow.